Did you know that when you pour cream into your coffee, you're witnessing the same physics that happens during volcanic eruptions? Volcanologist Tamsin Mather is a professor of earth sciences at the University of Oxford and author of Adventures in Volcano Land: What Volcanoes Tell Us About the World and Ourselves.
We live on the Earth's crust, that's the outer layer of the Earth, and then the mantle is the layer below that. And that's where the magmas that become lavas that drive volcanoes start their journey, start their life. The partial melting of the mantle. And part of the key thing about the mantle is, although it's solid, it convects very, very slowly. So convection currents is when you have something that's hotter underneath something that's cooler and it rises up. So one of the analogies that I use in the book is pouring milk or cream into my cup of coffee in the morning and watching the swirling patterns. It's particularly good if you've got one of those clear coffee mugs, the swirling patterns where you see the cold milk go down, heat up, and then come up again. And that makes me think about mantle convection.
Last month, there was a huge explosion at the Biscuit Basin Geyser in Yellowstone National Park. The video went viral and shows a massive expanding plume of steam, rock, and mud shooting up hundreds of feet into the air. From the untrained eye, it looked like the beginnings of a volcano eruption, but Michael Poland clears up the confusion. He's a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey and is currently scientist in charge of the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. Poland clarifies that even though Yellowstone is riddled with hot spots and volcanoes, this was a hydrothermal explosion and wasn't caused by volcanic activity.
These hot water systems can seal themselves because they carry around a lot of dissolved silica, and they will start precipitating that silica out, and that will coat the conduits, and then you start building pressure. And steam pressure is powerful, and it has created some really tremendous explosions in Yellowstone, especially if you look over the last, say, 10 to 15,000 years.
For a hydrothermal explosion, imagine a tea kettle that's been taped over and the water continues to boil, but there's nowhere for the steam to exit. Eventually, it'll blow up. Now, back to volcanoes. Whether volcanoes erupt from crevasses or mountaintops, Poland says no two volcanoes are alike.
One of the things we do as volcanologists is try to get to know each volcano, because volcanoes are kind of like people. They all have their own personalities and their own styles. And just because you know Mount St. Helens doesn't mean that you know Mount Rainier, even though they're close, even though they're in the same neighborhood. It's sort of like neighbors, right? Just because I know one person that lives on my block doesn't mean I know the other person. So Rainier's style is to have relatively small eruptions. The ash layers from Rainier, pretty small. Mount St. Helens and Glacier Peak have much thicker ash layers. They're much more explosive volcanoes. Rainier mostly does lava flows. But Rainier has a tremendous volume of snow and ice on it. And so when Rainier erupts, it has the potential to melt that snow and ice. And then you've got lahars, mud flows, rushing down the valleys.
Thalia Solomon is a Washington state resident who actually lives on Mount Rainier. She watched the movie Dante's Peak growing up and says living on an active volcano can be freaky sometimes.
In schools, they have to practice lahar evacuations. It's kind of eerie. It's really eerie. They say that they should have an idea leading up to it, what that means. It could be a day, it could be 30 minutes. I mean, we're putting a lot of faith into the monitoring it. But the idea is that they would know at least in enough time to evacuate.
But Solomon doesn't worry too much. If a siren went off, she would stay in her home. That's because she lives in the evacuation zone a ways up the mountain on the side that's at low risk. It's the people down in the valleys that must escape to her area. But wait, why run up Mount Rainier? Poland says a volcano evacuation isn't like the scenes depicted in Dante's Peak, where every inch is suddenly covered in fiery lava and ash, but she does say the flow from the volcano, or lahar, that's seen in the film is pretty accurate.
They're massively destructive. It is a flow of, calling it mud doesn't give it its due credit. It's like a slurry. It's basically like concrete. Very dense. It's carrying rocks and trees and whatever else it picks up. And it's kind of sweeping down these valleys. So It's like a flood, but a flood that's carrying an awful lot of debris and is really, really thick. So you got to get away from that.
In Mount Rainier's case, past eruptions dating back thousands of years have shown the paths in which this flow has traveled before. The idea behind evacuating towards the mountain is to gain high ground where the mud and debris flows don't reach.
Ash doesn't make it that far from eruptions of Rainier, but these mud flows can. So that's the hazard that we're really trying to socialize and get people to understand around Rainier.
And while most flee from eruptions, there are people who find the allure of active volcanoes an exciting draw. Volcanic tourism has been popular since the first group of visitors trekked up to Mount Vesuvius in 1841. Every year, millions of people flock to Iceland, Italy, Guatemala, Hawaii, and other active volcanic sites to see the power of these eruptions up close. But is it worth the risk?
They have inherent risk with them. Different systems, some systems are more risky than others. So the US volcanoes are generally very, very well monitored, and the USGS do a great job. They do have good warnings if things are waking up, usually. But sometimes you can get unexpected events. There were recent tragedies in New Zealand, for example, with White Island and tourists getting taken by surprise there. And there have been various legal cases about whether their tour company should have told them or there was a risk in going to the island. And in Japan, not that long ago as well, there were hikers who got killed at the top of a mountain there. So they are inherently risky things, but there are ways of managing the risk to make them safer. And it is also really important that people get to enjoy these magnificent structures.
As a researcher, Mather doesn't mind these risks and is happy she gets to spend her days witnessing these bigger-than-life events.
The volcanism in the Reykjanes Peninsula in Iceland just over the last few years, although it's a well-known volcanic area, they never quite know where the magma is going to break the surface and create a new fissure, which is a crack in the ground, and spring forth new lava flows. So they're monitoring it very closely, and they make maps of like the red zone, the amber zone, the yellow zone, where the highest probabilities are. Until about half an hour beforehand, it's really hard to be really clear.
She says the most exciting area in volcanology today is Iceland, along the Reykjanes Peninsula.
We haven't seen anything like that for 800 years. It's associated with the way that the tectonic plates are pulling apart. And it's really interesting that it seems to happen in these pulses where magma comes up and there'll be lots of movement, splitting of the two tectonic plates over the next few decades with this associated magmatism, so the associated volcanic activity. So for us, this is super exciting, right? We are alive during this 1 in 800 year event, and we get to study what's going on there. We could have missed it. Our human lives are so very short. So we feel very lucky that we're going to get to watch that, and get to watch that with all our modern instrumentation, where we can really try to get to grips with what's going on.
Tamsin Mather's book, Adventures in Volcanoland, What Volcanoes Tell Us About the World and Ourselves, is available now online and in select bookstores. To find out more about our guests this week and to see a video of the Basin Creek geyser explosion, head to viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes and to support our show, follow Viewpoints Radio on Instagram, X, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.